Hi, people. This week marks 3 years since the invasion of Ukraine. Just a poignant moment. That's 3 years since the invasion, but certainly not. Certainly, Russian aggression has been going on significantly longer than that. In fact, if we go back into history, we could a lot more of the 1930s, that devastating famine caused by Stalin, in which Ukraine was very heavily impacted. I mean, the Soviet Union saw severe food shortages across due to Stalin's policies, but Ukraine was particularly hard hit. Why do I mention that? Because when people expect Ukrainians to just give up the country, when they expect the sort of people I'm talking about, when they expect Ukraine to just capitulate, Ukrainians have a memory. Ukrainians know what it is to suffer on the front line of Russian aggression. They know that. Now, tomorrow evening, I'll be going to a concert. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a Ukrainian cultural event. I've actually got involved with the Ukrainian community here recently, and it's been an enriching experience. I found it enjoyable, if that's the right word, but informative and because honestly, early on in the war, I didn't know any Ukrainians. So it was important for me to make these sort of connections, and I have now. So tomorrow I'm going to that because what Russia wants to do is completely destroy Ukrainian culture. It's happened before in history, where we see cultures evaporated, and this is why the Ukrainian diaspora around the world, why they want to keep their culture alive. At least that's how I interpret it. And if I could play a small part in supporting that, then that's something. Um, but I cannot put in words how disgusted I am with Donald Trump. A few days ago, he was attacking Zelensky. Today, he's come out and attacked Keir Starmer, claiming that he has no peace plan for Ukraine. But Trump's peace plan is a facade. This is something that I really, really want to challenge. I mean, I'm not expecting any convert from MAGA Republicans because I think they're brainwashed. I don't think they're capable of critical thinking. But this notion that Trump just wants peace and Vance just wants peace and Rubio just wants peace, if they actually invited Ukraine, if Ukraine was part of this, you might believe that. You might believe it's a kind of humanitarian gesture because war is a terrible thing. Everyone wants the war to end. I mean, certainly the Ukrainians do. Speak to any Ukrainian and they will say, of course they want the war to end. The country's been through hell. Homes have been destroyed, people have been killed, people have been wounded. Of course they want it to end, but not at any price. And this isn't, or it shouldn't be difficult to understand. Earlier this week, I saw someone describe those who oppose Putin as war lovers, and this is one of the sort of distorted narratives that is out there, that if you oppose tyranny, you're somehow war loving. Let's not forget, it wasn't Ukraine that started this war, it wasn't NATO that started this war, it wasn't the West that started this war. Russia started this war on the 24th of February 2022 when it decided to invade the sovereign nation of Ukraine. That's the reality. People can talk all they want about supposedly how Russian speakers were persecuted in Ukraine. They could come up with all the sort of excuses that they can scratch the bottom of the barrel with, because the point I would make with that actually is if there was any solid evidence of any large-scale persecution of Russian speakers, would Russia not have presented its case to the UN? Instead, it's just spun out industrial-scale propaganda. It didn't make any serious attempt to bring any concern to the UN about that. And the thing is, it's got very strong echoes of what the Third Reich done in the Second World War, or leading up to the Second World War, the narrative about protecting German speakers. The reality is, Putin, remember, he's former KGB, he has never, ever accepted that the Cold War ended when it did. He has never accepted the collapse of the Soviet Union. He famously described it as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. But Putin wants to go even further than that. He doesn't want to just reclaim the old Soviet Union. He actually wants to reclaim the old Tsarist Empire, which at its peak was one of the biggest empires in history. Um, Certainly one of the biggest contiguous empires. Not quite as big as ours, but it was big. Covered millions of square kilometers. So Putin looks at countries like Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, certainly the Baltic states, I would suggest Poland as well, probably Finland. He really, really looked at that. And I think if he could get away with it, he would definitely push to try and get whatever territory he can. This narrative of Russia being surrounded by NATO, if you look at a map, the vast majority of Russia's land borders are in Asia. So it's nonsensical to say that it's surrounded by NATO. Why has NATO expanded? Because countries have literally felt they have had to join NATO, partly for protection. That was certainly what the Finnish president cited when Finland joined 2 years ago. It's this mentality that Russia has. If we just bully people and threaten people, they'll keep on side. It's nonsensical. Practically, it's foolish. Leaving aside all the moral issues, it's not very clever, because it's only going to make Russia even more hated in that part of the world. Even Russia's allies, supposedly in the region, haven't been gung-ho about supporting this war in Ukraine. I'm thinking of countries like Kazakhstan and the Central Asian republics. In fact, a lot of Russian men have fled to those countries to avoid being called up. And I don't blame them. Well, if I was a Russian citizen, I sure as hell wouldn't want to be used as cannon fodder for Putin's irredentist obsessions. I always say, when people criticize Russians, why don't they speak up more? There's a very real price to pay. Anyone who's spoken up has found themselves either in prison, in some remote penal colony in Siberia, poisoned, meeting some untimely accident, or vilified. It is very, very difficult in the Russian system to stand up, have an independent voice. And that is why when I look at people, particularly Westerners, who live in the West, when they come out with pro-Putin narratives, when they come out with their appeasement, it really, really, really disgusts me. I honestly think what we've seen in Riyadh has strong echoes of 1938. Now, history never repeats exactly. There'll be a few different contexts, but broadly speaking, what do we have? We have a country that has been invaded and subjugated. We have a dictator hell-bent on reclaiming irredentist land as he sees it. And we have appeasement. So there are some echoes. Except I think Trump's worse than Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain, I think, did make a historic mistake. There is some historians now that said it wasn't so much appeasement but a policy of containment. And there's been some more generous reassessments of Neville Chamberlain's approach. But I think it can be honestly said that when he was at the Munich conference, there has to have been some naivety there. Remember, World War I was within living memory. It's very understandable. If you were in the 1930s, it's very, very understandable that people wanted to avoid another global war. Churchill was seen as a warmonger and a fringe figure. So it's totally understandable that Neville Chamberlain was very popular at the time. But now there's not that same context of not having a precedent. We do have a precedent, and it resulted in World War II. I'm not suggesting that World War III is about to break out. I mean, there's been a lot of international incidents, certainly the invasion of Ukraine was one, where there's been the speculation of World War III breaking out. It may actually be that the Third World War, if we even term it that way, Churchill himself actually described, I believe, the 7 Years' War, 7 Years' Wars and the Napoleonic Wars as global conflict. So if we want to get pedantic about this, we may actually be looking at the Sixth or Seventh World War. That's, in the popular mind, of course, the events of the 20th century, the First and Second World Wars. I'm just thinking, the Third World War may not necessarily break out at one clearly defined moment, in the way that the invasion of Poland triggered World War II in Europe, or the Japanese invasion of Manchuria triggered the war in Asia. It may be that the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was prelude to this. Um, is it a world war at the moment? At the time, it was speculated actually World War II has already begun. I'm not sure we can really say that because at the moment the battlefield is contained to Ukraine. It's a major war, but it is contained to one country. Now, if this spreads, will there be a point where we could say this really is World War II? World War III. Um, China so far has avoided being dragged in. I think to be defined as a global conflict, you'd need to have other major powers on the side of Russia. And right now, Russia's basically alone. What does it have? It has Belarus, it has North Korea. On the surface, it has China, but China hasn't committed any troops. It hasn't even given any weapons. I think China sees Russia as a junior partner. It's sort of the reverse of the situation in the 1950s when the Soviet Union was the senior partner. Certainly, China is no friend of the West, and I don't think we could trust China, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily going to throw itself into this situation, and I don't think it wants to. I think the CCP is far more interested in Taiwan, so they're just looking at what's happening in Ukraine. Um, So, in that sense, it's not necessarily a global war, but it could still be a very dangerous situation. And remember World War II, nuclear warfare had only been developed at the very end of that. In fact, at that point, it was atomic warfare. So, in a sense, it's even more dangerous than World War II because we now have the reality that both the United States and Russia are nuclear powers. Um, I do think Donald Trump is dangerous for his stupidity. For him to come out and attack Starmer today, well, firstly, attacking Zelensky as a dictator. Ukraine's had about 5 presidents in the last, say, 15 years. In that same period, Belarus and Russia have essentially had one dictator each. I don't count the Putin-Medvedev tandem because Putin was effectively pulling the strings. Um, Even the New York Post, I believe it was, had a big picture saying President Trump, this is what dictator looks like, showing Putin. So even the New York Post, which is, a pretty right-wing publication, even they were mildly rebuking Trump over this very crass and insulting attack on Zelensky. Now, Zelensky isn't perfect, no one is, but I don't think he deserves the sort of some of the spite that he has received. You get people saying he just wants Western money. It's all a big scam. He just wants the money. I put it to them. Any leader in Zelensky's position, any leader who's had their country invaded, would do absolutely everything they can to get international support, including financial and military aid. Why wouldn't Zelensky do that? I think this guy is an inspiration. I think he has shown remarkable leadership in the most trying circumstances. Bear in mind, he's still only in his mid-40s. I believe he's a much better man and leader than Donald Trump will ever be. He's not perfect. There are some internal political tensions in Ukraine because, unlike Russia, dissent actually is allowed. Um, but there is also the context that this is a war. So Zelensky does have to take certain war powers. Churchill did. Abraham Lincoln did. There are certain things that will happen in wartime that don't happen in peacetime. But that was crass for Trump. You know what is incredible? That they actually acted surprised. Surprised. I believe it was J.D. Vance actually reacted with surprise that the Ukrainians dared to complain that they weren't invited to the so-called peace talks. And as for this attack on Starmer, Starmer is not a popular prime minister. He's not got everything right. I don't like his stance on China. I don't like some of his domestic policies. But when it comes to Ukraine, I believe he's absolutely right to take a strong line on that. And one thing I can say, I think we should be look at with more optimism is the fact that Tory and Labour governments have been consistent on the issue of Russia and Ukraine. This isn't a major partisan issue in this country, and I'm pleased it isn't. I'd say it's a bigger partisan issue even in other European countries. In Germany, former Chancellor Gerhard Schroder was expelled from the SPD for its support for Putin. I think in Britain, I think the Ukrainians would probably regard us as one of their most reliable allies, and I'd honestly say I'm proud of my country for that. So I do believe that Starmer is right about Ukraine. Whether sending troops in is practical or not, I'm not sure, but we can never say never. There was one former SAS veteran that went on GB News to denounce Starmer and say would never serve for him. Well, as a former veteran, he should know that they don't sign up to the Prime Minister of the day, they sign up to the Crown. So I believe the guy was just pushing a partisan agenda, being that it was GB News. But I digress. The point I want to make in this video is Trump is just a disgrace. What he has done this week, appeasing Putin, freezing Ukraine out of the talks, it's beyond reprehensible. And Vance, for him to turn around and lecture Europe on freedom, whilst he's part of an administration that's appeasing Putin, not to mention the fact his own boss has tried to crack down on domestic criticism. Trump would dearly like to shut up domestic critics. I think Trump actually envies Putin a bit. I do believe that's part of it. Marco Rubio, once upon a time he was a kind of reasonable Republican, the sort of Republican that recognises dictatorship. Rubio has a record of speaking out against the Castro regime. And now what is he doing? He's talking to Sergei Lavrov, freezing the Ukrainians out, not answering reporters' questions. In the 1930s, there was a publication called The Guilty Men, which I believe one of the contributors to that book was a future Labour leader, Michael Foot. It was a book actually condemning the appeasers of the 1930s. If such a book would be published today, it would definitely name Trump, Vance and Rubio, and there'd be a few others. We have Tulsi Gabbard, who, as far as I'm concerned, is a pro-Kremlin propagandist. We have Tucker Carlsson, who's an even more outspoken pro-Kremlin propagandist. I think Carlsson is beneath contempt. I really think he's disgusting. I don't want to just throw out expletives and really get into colourful language here, but I find it very hard to have any level of respect for Putin appeasers and particularly Putin cheerleaders who live in the West. I've personally come across a few of them. They are a minority, but they're a vocal minority. It's incredible that people who are so damn wrong can be so confident. And I don't know what it is. I don't know if they're just trying to be edgy and different, or if they genuinely admire Putin. I don't know what it is. That they cannot see the wood for the trees, that they cannot see what is plain for everyone else to see, that Russia invaded Ukraine. And what sickens me is this idea that people just expect the Ukrainians to capitulate. These hypocrites absolutely wouldn't take the same stance if the United States or the UK was invaded. The idea of surrendering to the enemy, of just kowtowing to their demands, it would be unthinkable. The Ukrainians do want peace, but not at any price. What sort of peace is that? Peace being, in the context of subservience to a more powerful neighbour isn't peace. It's slavery. I just think what's happened this week is disgusting. Whatever Trump does in his second term, that will forever condemn him. I think he's the worst president in American history. And I think for him to come out with the stuff he's come out with, but even if he has some sort of medical issue and Vance has to take over, Vance's track record speaks for itself. Vance is mini Trump. It doesn't quite have the pull that Trump has, so that's one good thing. So maybe the MAGA cult will end with Trump, whether he dies naturally or he resigns due to poor health or whatever the case may be. In the last video, I got a lot of responses. I wasn't able to get around to everyone. Thank you for those who gave positive responses. I did have one pro-Kremlin troll. I didn't delete his comments, but I told him exactly what I thought. Frankly, I don't mince my words when it comes to Putin apologists. I have no respect for them, and I'm not going to give them any respect. Because I personally know people who've lost loved ones, who've lost their homes, and who are now on the cusp of losing their country. And I know how courageous those people are. So When I think of them, and I think of loads in our midst who think the approach to this is just to appease Putin. There is another point, though. People might say, it's not our war. Why should we get involved in Ukraine? Even if you want to disregard the Ukrainians' struggle, say, well, that's nothing to do with us. Consider the fact that Russia basically launched chemical warfare on our streets in Salisbury in 2018. I mean, that really was an act of war. Anyone who thinks that Putin can be trusted is deranged. And here's the thing, the West did actually try to accommodate Putin. We tried to bring him into the fold. Remember, Russia was a member of the G8. That wasn't a junior partner. That was being treated as an equal. I cite the case of the Kursk when Britain and Norway offered assistance to Russia and it was refused. Putin would rather put national pride before allowing assistance, and as a result, over 60 men died. Thousands and thousands of young Russian men have been killed and wounded for an irredentist war that will not benefit Russians in any way. The Russian economy is in tatters. What's Putin doing? He's relying on North Korean conscripts and prisoners. The good thing is these appeasers, these cheerleaders are a minority, but they're not non-existent. I would speculate this: if you had 10 people and they all had opinions on the war in Ukraine, I would say probably 6 or 7 would be supportive of Ukraine, 1 would be undecided, and 2 would be pro-Putin, something like that. I mean, if you look at a comment thread on the news network, it would be. I was just looking at the sort of comments people were coming out with when with this report about Trump's insult towards Starmer. I do think Starmer needs to be a little bit more assertive. I do think at some point it would be absolutely legitimate for Starmer to push back a bit. So far, his strategy seemed to be we better not offend Trump, even when Trump is insulting him personally. I think Starmer's attitude is I need to be the adult in the room and rise above it. But at some point, as a matter of, not about Starmer personally, but a matter of, frankly, patriotism, I do think we need to push back a bit. We cannot have foreign policy based on fear of America and American power. The sad reality is we can't trust America at the moment. We certainly can't trust Russia or China, but we can no longer trust the United States of America. I'm not talking about the American people, because I know there's many decent Americans who do oppose Trump, but it cannot be forgotten the majority of Americans that voted to put Trump back into the White House. So honestly, right now, I think America is unreliable. I think America is unstable. I'm talking about its international outlook. So we need to get a little bit back on and realise we don't have to overly rely on the United States. Yes, Trump will threaten tariffs if we don't absolutely pander to all of his demands. But look at what Canada and Mexico done. They did push back a bit. I think if Western Europe collectively stood up to Trump, including Britain, I do think he would back down a bit. There'll be a lot of insults and there'll be a lot of rhetoric, but I do believe a lot of what Trump comes out with is noise. Apparently the American ambassador to Kiev said this is just Trump being Trump. But even that in itself, even if it's all hot air, that in itself is dangerous because it leaves allies uncertain. Some would say, well, it confuses Putin, but it also confuses allies. And that's dangerous. I mean, I say allies. Is Trump an ally? I think we need to get over this idea that, I do believe in a special relationship, but at this point, how valid is that when we're dealing with the United States under Donald Trump? I do think it changes the picture. I am not anti-American, and I think it's utterly tragic that this guy has been put back into office, but that's the reality we're dealing with, and I think that we need to, I'm not saying pick a fight with Trump, I'm saying we do need to push back a bit. At some point, Starmer is going to have to say we can't just keep taking these insults. We have to push back a little bit. And I would like to think, if anything escalated regarding, for example, Greenland, I would like to think we would back the Danes. If anything escalated regarding Canada, I'd like to think we back the Canadians. I do not believe in this policy of just pander to Trump, just give him what he wants. I know it's not easy standing up to him because America is the world's biggest economy, but we have a situation right now where the United States, China, and Russia are all run by autocrats. The United States isn't a full-on dictatorship the way the other two are, but I do believe Donald Trump would have it that way if he could get away with it. I really, the rhetoric speaks for itself. So I think we need to continue to condemn Putin's enablers, Putin's cheerleaders, Putin's appeasers. They can talk about people being pro-war. It's not about pro-war, it's anti-tyranny. That's point one. And point two, we need to keep supporting Ukraine. This doesn't mean troops on the ground necessarily. There are pros and cons to that, but we absolutely are right. I believe Starmer met Zelensky today. That's absolutely the right approach. Zelensky needs reassurance that Western leaders aren't just going to cave in to Trump's demands. Trump needs to see that he's on his own, except for maybe a few other individuals, perhaps Viktor Orban in Hungary and a few others. But major Western powers need to show that we are not so weak that we just have to pander to what America does. And yeah, Europe does need to step up.